everybody and welcome to Fraudible, the video podcast that brings together academics and practitioners to discuss all things fraud. In this episode we're going to be discussing fraud and doorstep crime, and I am absolutely delighted to be joined by academic and Dr. Tim Day and practitioner Emily Kershaw. And thank you for joining me both. And Tim, would you mind introducing yourself and your work, please?
As you said, I'm Dr. Tim Day. I was awarded a professional doctorate from the Institute of Criminal Justice Studies at the University of Portsmouth back in 2019, and that was for my work on white-collar crime, fraud, and specifically road trading doorstep crime. So my thesis examined the way that the police record crime type, the victim profile. I also examined the way the crime manifests, and then the police response to the crime type as well. In addition to that, I'm co-founder and co-director of anti-fraud consultancy, Carter and Day Consultancy, alongside Dr. Elizabeth Carter, and I hold the role of lead officer for the Chartered Trading Standards Institute for doorstep crime, scams, and consumer vulnerability. And though I'm here today sort of representing the academic side of the debate, my sort of day job, if you like, is still as a Chartered Trading Standards practitioner within a local authority trading standards department, where I've specialised in investigation and enforcement of doorstep crime for about the last 15 years or so.
Amazing, thank you very much. Emily?
Yeah, I'm Emily Kershaw. I'm currently a detective sergeant with Derbyshire Police. I've been in the job for 11 years, currently based in the economic crime unit within a subsection team vulnerability fraud unit, which deals predominantly with fraud targeting vulnerable people. Specifically, we tend to look at romance, career and abusive position type fraud at the moment, but that is due to change over the next sort of 12 months or so with a broader remit coming into us specifically. But prior to that, I've worked in a lot of different roles across policing that would encompass sort of that response to doorstep crime, that's uniform policing, safe neighbourhood policing, and obviously, like I say, now in the world of fraud.
Excellent, thank you very much. So, Tim, this is, I believe, the first episode of Fraudible where we are discussing in-person crime, and predominantly, obviously, the other kinds of fraud that we've spoken about on previous episodes can have that in-person element, but this is purely in person. So could you give some examples of doorstep crime specifically?
So it's a really interesting one. Like you said, actually, all of the previous episodes have been around sort of cyber-enabled fraud, whereas this is very much kind of the old school type of fraud where you've always got that kind of face-to-face interaction. So the kind of things we're looking at, I mean, we're not helped insofar as there is no kind of definitive Home Office definition for what the crime type is. So the way I defined it for a paper back in 2015 was any incident where a consumer is targeted for by individual or individuals overcharging for unsatisfactory goods or services. And that would include things like carrying out unnecessary work, causing criminal damage in order to create a need for work, and aggressive behaviour in order to require payment as well. So it encompasses all of those things. And previously it would have been traditionally sort of a cold call from somebody who happens to be working in the area, who just happened to notice you've got a loose roof tile, that kind of thing. That's sort of how it used to unfold traditionally. But what we've seen, and one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about it is we've seen quite a sort of distinct change in MO now, where certainly since the pandemic, it's accelerated with lockdowns and things, where offenders now will routinely look to get themselves put onto approved trader schemes so that they're not having to do those cold calls anymore. And actually it's victims phoning them and inviting them to come and quote for work.
Okay, and is that more of a preference, I suppose, to try and distance themselves from the crime in a way, because they can say that they didn't approach anyone because they were the one being approached?
Absolutely. So prior to 2015, the definition that was sort of bandied around a lot did use the phrase cold caller. And I think, I deliberately removed it because even back in 2015, I was seeing a lot of road traders hitting an area with leaflets and flyers and dropping those through letterboxes, inviting again the consumer to call the rogue trader rather than it being a traditional cold call. And as I say, with the pandemic and approved trader platform scheme type things now, that's only accelerated. So yeah, I've taken out that kind of the need for a cold call, because we've seen it change and move sort of quite significantly.
Emily, is that in line with things that you've seen on the ground, as it were?
Yeah, definitely, in terms of not so much that. We still get a lot of reports of people doing the old school knock on the door and the kind of the cold approach, but generally we also, that's perhaps either followed up with or preceded by the leaflet drop or the provision of sort of a seemingly legitimate company front. And again, that ties back into what Tim's talked about there with your sort of registered trader kind of platforms, which I think there's perhaps sometimes a lack of public awareness around the reality of some of those, because some of those are simply that you pay to register yourself with it, and then you can use their branding or their logo, their endorsement. And actually, I think sometimes the public think that it is something you have to be given or awarded, kind of, as opposed to kind of just go and obtain with probably not too much sort of scrutiny. And then that adds to that the idea of legitimacy, doesn't it? If you've got a recognised logo that you can put on your van or your leaflets, etc., the public might be less inclined to question it, like Tim's talked about, and may even actually initiate that contact, which just takes them that step away from that approach. But also perhaps they might just increase their customer pool simply by doing it. So I think it definitely does marry in with what we see.
I think as well as there's definitely that kind of, we call it legitimate guys, kind of, where they do all that they can to mirror legitimate traders. But I think as well, the other thing that the approved trader schemes allow is that you've already got a client base that knows they need work. So if you're trawling the streets, cold calling, knocking on doors, 8-9 times out of 10, you're probably going to be told to do one. Whereas if you've got people calling you, when you then tell them that yes, they do need work doing, it's not a surprise to them. Half the job in terms of convincing them has already been done, because just by nature of it, they're calling you because they want some work carried out.
Yeah.
In our prep call a few weeks ago, you were talking about how the work that you do and the level of attention it gets is very much driven by the government and sort of how politically driven it is. Do you think that that's going to change in the future, Emily, or do you think that this is just so commonplace now that the whole time that these online frauds are so big in the news and so hot on everyone's lips that actually doorstep crime is just going to be continually swept under the carpet because it might be seen as not a big enough threat at the moment?
I think it's a really valid point that rogue trading and another one that we see a lot of, that kind of in-person aspect of it, is the kind of power of attorney related ones where it's a known person that's in your life. They are kind of a subset of this kind of much broader world of cyber fraud, which is, as we all just said, gets the vast majority of attention and perhaps resource in that way, and certainly the public awareness kind of attention around it, understandably, because it's massive, isn't it, and so varied and so broad. But I do think there is a danger that doorstep crime and rogue trading, that kind of more traditional fraud, could get lost in that. And they are very distinct. They require a very distinct type of response, a very distinct type of investigation, and so there is a danger that just by lumping it into fraud as a general thing, and particularly when you start talking about funding or strategic priorities, they are different. They require a slightly different response, but yes, then sort of become lumped into this much bigger category, which largely isn't really that comparable in many ways.
Because I imagine that if you were to go up to someone and ask them what types of fraud they know about, Tim, I would imagine that doorstep crime would not necessarily be near the top of the list.
No, I think that's exactly right. I don't think there is particularly a widespread sort of awareness of it. It's one of those things that doesn't crop up too much. Media attention doesn't get too great. As we've spoken in terms of just enforcement response as well, and response from financial institutions is hugely varied and not particularly high as well. So, yeah, I don't think it's one that's really sort of caught the public imagination in quite the same way as something like romance fraud has over the last few years, for instance. And I think, again, like part of that is because it's so difficult to show the extent of it with the lack of definitive definition and no crime flag on police recording systems. I've talked about in some of my articles like the difficulty in retrieving an accurate evidence base around this kind of crime type, you know. So not only do we suffer with doorstep crime the same way as other frauds do in terms of the underreporting from victims who may not know they're a victim in the first instance, or may think it's futile to report, or for whatever reason, you know, may not even know where to report to, whether it be financial institution, police, trading standards, whoever. But I think in addition to that, you've got this sort of difficulty whereby, sorry, I really lost my train of thought there.
I think just jumping off the back of what you've mentioned there about the lack of flag, I think from my experience in sort of practical policing, it does create so many problems, because if I was to sit here now and I wanted to go back to my, you know, force and say, right, you know, we need to put together a road trading team or specific kind of focus, or I want to bring this into my unit for whatever reason, I would need to be able to rationalise that to say, why do I want to do it? Why do I think it's such a problem that we need to do that? How many resources do we need to put to that then? And all of those completely legitimate questions require being able to answer it based on data and understanding what is your problem, what are your patterns, what's your volume, what kind of jobs would you be taking, what kind of investigations would they look like. And I know that I would really struggle to pull that data from our systems, because problems of inconsistent recording, things being recorded as a theft, not a fraud, things being recorded as a harassment perhaps. And so it creates this kind of cycle in a way, like it becomes very difficult to understand what the problem is, to then be able to justify saying why it needs to be a priority, particularly in the world of policing, where fraud is a massive crime type, but it is one type of an absolute myriad of things that the police have to deal with. And so when you're competing for resources against lots of other very varied things, you have to be able to justify what you're saying you need. And that's very difficult when you can't accurately and quickly pull from your data. And I think a flag, like I know you spoke about before, Tim, with similar to distraction burglary type things, having a flag would probably be very helpful for that reason, because then police can start to certainly more easily than they can now, understand what they've got, because at the minute you're very much beholden to how that gets recorded by either the person who's answered the phone in the call centre or the officer that goes out and attends, and then you become reliant on their understanding of the circumstances, the legislation, the offence, etc. And things will absolutely get lost in that kind of false recording sense. So yeah, there are difficulties around understanding what the problem is, partly for that reason.
Yeah, totally agree. It's not just about the underreporting. There's also an issue around underrecording as well. And I think there's a vicious circle until we've got a definitive definition and a crime flag where we can start to interrogate some of this data and build up a proper picture. There's real uncertainty there. So exactly as Emily said, is this recorded against harassment? Is it recorded against criminal damage? There's so many crime codes currently that it could sit within that sort of particularises it, so you can't actually retrieve it all that easily. And the other thing that I see a lot of is I guess, again, because of the lack of definition and lack of understanding as well amongst those who are responding. So whether that be in the control room in the first instance, sort of miscategorising issues as a civil dispute or a trading standards matter rather than a fraud, for instance, or whether it comes later with police response. And best one in the world, Emily's talked about how busy police are and things like that. Some of these investigations are complex and complicated and time consuming, and we're asking that in a non-priority area of people who are already over busy. So I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why it hasn't necessarily got the attention that it perhaps requires. And I think it all sort of feeds in around this kind of lack of understanding, lack of definition, and lack of ability to retrieve that evidence base that you can then stake a claim against to say, well, look, we do need to be doing more with this.
Yeah, because I think if you sort of take the current public view of the police, I guess it's not exactly positive at the moment. So I guess there's that assumption that they just don't want to do anything about it, as opposed to actually realising the intricacies of the constraints that you're under, Emily.
Yeah, I think obviously, the public opinion of the police is and will always be led largely by the media for me, and the focus that the media give on certain aspects. And absolutely, of course, accountability and transparency is completely the priority, but I do think sometimes that tide of media portrayal does turn and definitely have that impact. And it is a shame because, in all the years I've been in policing, I absolutely have and will say that I've seen investigations that are not particularly great quality. I've seen lines of inquiry not being picked up quickly enough or in detail enough. But occasions where I've seen sort of willful lack of action, I can think of one occasion in 11 years that I've been aware of an officer who's perhaps said they've done something they've not, or not done something that they've said they have. And so I think it's easy for the public perhaps to look at the police and think, oh, they just don't want to, or they don't care. And I don't see that from within it at all. I don't think that's the case. I think it's, in the context of what we're talking about in fraud, there's a vast lack of understanding around fraud across general policing provision. A lot of people have a bit of a fear of it for some reason. It's sort of seen as just innately complex and difficult to understand, which is a shame, because actually when you look at the individual criminal fraud offences, they're really straightforward. They're very it's essentially theft with a bit of a lie, isn't it? It's not, the type of investigations can get complex. The application of those offences in real world situations can be incredibly complex. But there can be a little bit of a reticence about fraud from the start, which creates this idea of, oh, I don't really understand it. It needs to be a specialist unit. It needs, etc. And that's not always the case. And I think road trading, kind of doorstep crime, perhaps isn't helped actually by, it's such a complex world around fraud, isn't it? There's so many different bodies and so many different agencies, and they've all got their own defined remit, but then they all sort of overlap with each other. And it took me a long time, when I came into fraud about 16 months ago, it took me a long time to understand the process of fraud as it's meant to happen in this country, and what was action fraud and what was our relationship with action fraud, and what should we expect and what should they expect. And likewise, then you've got bodies like the trading standards, and you've kind of got to go through the same process of understanding, well, what do you do and what do we do, and how does that overlap? And then when it does overlap, well, how do we manage that overlap then? Because that overlap has to be managed. We can't just both sit here going, oh, that's a trading standards matter, and trading standards are going, oh, well, that's a police matter, because actually by rights it's both, but then someone has to own it. And I think that can become quite complicated and feeds into the police going to things sometimes and going, oh, it's trading standards. And then that's how we will perhaps file it, or that's what we say to the victim is, oh, you need to go to trading standards with that. And then that victim might go to trading standards and get told, oh, you need to report it to the police. And it's because there's not that communication in a lot of cases between trading standards and the police directly to understand and agree what that relationship's going to look like in that locality, I think.
It's a typical ask your mother, ask your father type thing, isn't it? You're just sort of being passed from one person to another. Tim, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, wholeheartedly agree. And I think, you can't avoid the fact that both of those agencies we're talking about there are really underfunded, and through sort of 13 years of austerity have suffered huge cuts. Trading standards has suffered in the region of about 50% cuts since the 2011, 2013 sort of time. And that has a huge impact on what we can and can't do. Similarly, police, not only have they had to deal with their own cuts to budgets, but also there's been an increase in service demand as other agencies kind of fall away. So things like out-of-hours mental health provision, for instance, that just doesn't exist in a lot of places anymore. So now the police get dragged into an area where they're perhaps not the most appropriate, but they're the only ones left. So, I think it's understandable. I think it's not even just police and trading standards as well. I think there's a fair amount of understanding amongst CPS. And again, we know about their sort of caseloads and how busy they are. But, I worked recently on a case where a police officer had put in a full file to CPS for a road trading incident, quite extreme one actually. The offenders had tried to get the victim, when he ran out of money and couldn't afford to pay them anymore, tried to get them to sign over the property to the offenders as well. So the full file was put in, and CPS turned around and said, no, this is a Consumer Rights Act issue, it's one for trading standards. And you just think, well, in that instance, that officer has put an incredible amount of work and a lot of time into putting that full file together and evidencing it. And you can see why, if that's the response from CPS, the next time a job like that comes along, they're not going to be too keen to be taking it on if all that work ultimately ends in nothing, So there is an awful lot more to be done. There's a whole regulatory framework around this as well. So it's not just, the Fraud Act, which is, as Emily said, quite simple, albeit maybe not so much in practice. But beneath that, there sits a whole regulatory framework as well. And the police and CPS knowledge about that is pretty low. That's sort of trading standards bread and butter. And that's why I think it often gets battered to trading standards. A lot of the regulatory framework offences kind of mirror the Fraud Act, but without that need to show deliberate dishonesty. So very often on a practical level, we'll charge in the alternate, so fraud and or consumer protection for unfair trading regulations offence, for instance, and that can really help. But knowledge and training around that, again, is really patchy and not a particularly high level. So it is very much, I think, around how do we work better together, what is the options for closer partnership working. Because at the moment, it feels at times almost like it's decriminalised in terms of the response that it receives. It's a difficult one to do, because if you want to evidence anything like work that's taken place that was unnecessary or even a gross overcharge, for a start, you might not be getting the reports because consumers don't really know. The reason that they go to traders is because they don't have the expert knowledge themselves, so they don't necessarily know they've been defrauded. And even if you get it reported and it gets recorded accurately, if you want to evidence it, unfortunately, then by and large, you're going to require an expert witness who can give an opinion as to the quality of the work, the necessity of it, and the charge, or whether it meets a gross overcharge as well. So there's an additional cost, quite apart from the investigatory process around this, that is borne just in having to evidence it as well. So I think there's an awful lot there. Really the key is better information sharing and closer partnership working, so that we can learn from each agency and benefit each other for a better service to the public, and make sure that people who are by and large professional organised criminals aren't allowed to operate almost unhindered.
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, in an ideal world, each force would have a road trading unit that sat in the same office as their local trading standards unit, and they would literally be able to have that genuine working together approach. But that isn't realistic, and it simply isn't going to happen because of all the funding things, etc., all you've talked about. And I think, because there are examples, I know we've had a local example over the last few years, that probably quite a good example of where that does work. So Trading Standards had a report that they investigated, and they got to the point of sort of charges being brought around a rogue trader. And then actually, as more and more reports came forward, Trading Standards actually came to the police and said, you might be interested in this actually now with I think the original Trading Standards job was around 25,000, and then with the other victims identified, that pool was about 50, so overall about £75,000 worth of offending. And our organised crime unit took the secondary pool, if you like, and so police ran that investigation, but off the back of a Trading Standards original investigation, and then at the point of charge, and the suspect has now been charged with those, hopefully that will probably get amalgamated into one kind of prosecution. But I think that's a good example of where I think that's happened from a police perspective, because Trading Standards had done that initial bit and were able to come and say, look, this is the situation, this is what we've done, this is what we think, and then probably work with that team and that officer to kind of go through that process with them, albeit Trading Standards haven't then owned that whole investigation, if that makes sense. But I think, there needs to be realism around what can we expect police forces to take versus Trading Standards, because ultimately we are two separate bodies that could be looking at exactly the same people for the same things. There has to be that communication, and there has to be a very defined understanding for me around that relationship between each local force and its local Trading Standards, whether that's saying, the police will try and take ownership for doorstep crime where it's got an organised crime element. So if it's being done by people mapped against an organised criminal network, perhaps the police will own that. But if it's an individual kind of lone operator, perhaps that sits more with trading standards. I don't know. That would be for each relationship to kind of set. But I think it has to come from that kind of origin, I think, really, for that effective partnership kind of working.
Is that something, Tim, from your perspective, that's how it should be but never will be? Are there discussions around how this can be better, or is it just a case of this is how we've always done it, this is all we can do, therefore it needs to stay this way kind of attitude?
No, I think there is a real desire to do better. I think, we recognise maybe the way we've always done it isn't all that effective, and it does need change. And from a personal perspective, I'm not precious about who takes primacy of jobs. As long as they get done effectively, and we're getting victims justice. We're utilising POCA, we're getting people put away, that kind of thing. As I say, I don't really mind who takes primacy, and actually, if I'm in a position to advise police in terms of that regulatory framework, then I'll do it. At Trading Standards, we will come and support in terms of come and do interviews once people have been arrested, advise on different charges, all of that kind of stuff, like anything that we can do effectively to try and close that net and make things a bit more effective. Yeah.
So you've mentioned how doorstep crime has changed over the last 10 or so years. What does it look like now for the next 10 years? Where's it going?
That's a really interesting one. And although there has been some kind of changes in terms of the method of approach, what's interesting is just how similar the crime type is now as it was, turn of the century. So if we go back sort of 25 years, it's virtually unchanged. And I think part of that is because it hasn't had to. It's a way of making an awful lot of money for people engaged in it. So unless or until they have to change, I don't see it changing rapidly. I think one of the things on the horizon that's going to be really interesting is how the PSR rules in October affect this, and whether or not the definition of APP frauds includes instances of doorstep crime rogue trading. If it does, I think that's going to be enormous for consumers, and I think it needs to, because as we said, consumers aren't experts; they don't necessarily know. And when you've got a situation where you can get registered as a limited company and signed up on approved trader platforms, there's only so much consumers can do when they don't have that knowledge. We talk about sort of market context vulnerability. Best will in the world, I don't know how much my roof should cost. All of that kind of stuff. So I think there's a limited amount consumers can do to protect themselves. So I think if the PSR regs does include APP fraud in the form of doorstep crime, then that would be massive for victims and much needed. But I do wonder where it will leave enforcement of this crime type. We've talked already about being overstretched amongst agencies. We've already talked about lack of priority area, potentially. That's even with the financial harm that we can demonstrate. And I've been involved in cases of hundreds of thousands of detriment. In fact, I was involved in what was at the time the single biggest incident of rogue trading doorstep crime, which was £950,000 losses to one couple. So the losses that we're talking about can be extreme, and we've seen property signed over to offenders or bequeathed to them in their wills, for instance. So it can be hugely extreme. And if we're in a situation where, whilst it can be hugely extreme, it's still not seen as a priority area, I do just wonder if the PSR regs start to cover victim losses for APP fraud involving rogue trading and doorstep crime, whether that priority area will fall even more. Will agencies look at this and say, well, hold on a minute, if they're getting their money back anyway, why are we pouring resource into this when we've got other things to do? And so, as difficult as it is at the moment in terms of potential decriminalisation just because of a lack of understanding, I do wonder what's going to happen if that occurs and what that will mean in terms of the enforcement response. So that's definitely one to keep an eye on. And I think, if we don't want to decriminalise it, if we do want to support victims, particularly those who are older and vulnerable, then I think it does need to stay very much on the agenda. But we'll see.
I think that's a really valid point, because it is a legitimate factor of consideration that's taken when you're looking at certain types of investigations. Is what's the gain at the end of the investigation potentially? Is the goal to get money back? Is the goal to get a criminal justice outcome, etc. And at the point where you perhaps might, for whatever reason, be looking at a situation thinking, well, I don't think we're going to get the evidence to reach a criminal justice threshold, because obviously it's high. And then you've kind of got to marry up what becomes proportionate around what are we trying to achieve. And if we start to have serious doubts around whether we're going to get a successful criminal justice outcome, and that money has been returned, and a significant portion of that money has been returned, and perhaps, it's not uncommon that the suspects in any type of fraud, not just this one, will get the money, but that money disappears very quickly. And then when you want to start looking at restraints and asset recovery, well, if they don't have any assets that you can identify and get, as much as we might want to get the money back, a criminal justice outcome itself doesn't get money back. And we do often see a lot from members of the public that when they report a fraud, whatever type it is, when you ask them what do you want, they want their money back. And we've had it time and time again in different types of frauds, but where we've had like property rental type fraud is a great example. We had a case of someone who had defrauded lots and lots of people around taking deposits and rent payments when they weren't a landlord at all. And every single one of the victims that we approached there to get a statement and would they support a prosecution, ultimately at the point they had money back or understood that we as an agency couldn't get their money back, no longer wanted to support a criminal prosecution. So it will be interesting to see what Tim said around how our agency is going to weigh that assessment up over what's proportionate and what's the priority going to be if victims are getting a portion of money back, but also how's that going to impact the victims? Are they going to be as inclined to report it? Because ultimately what they want out of that report is their money back 9 times out of 10. That's what, and it's understandable, isn't it? If I lost £10,000, I would want £10,000 back. If I had it back, and particularly, things take years and years to get through court sometimes. You're kind of asking someone to sign up to a commitment to support a process that could take easily 12, 18 months. And actually, if they've already got that money back, are they going to support that? I don't know. It will raise a lot of sort of secondary unintended obstacles, potentially, whilst being a good thing in itself, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Tim, closing thoughts from you on fraud and doorstep crime?
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones where, as I said, just because of that lack of definition around the crime type, it's always suffered. We've never been able to really measure and monitor it and evaluate it and therefore make evidence-based decisions around resourcing and things like that. And unless or until that changes, I don't see it being radically different. We talked there about the PSR and what difference that might make as well. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the people engaged in this are professional criminals in the majority of times. And it doesn't feel right that we step back from that, that there's more beyond just the purely financial. For a lot of the offenders, there's a level of kudos in the amount of exploitation and manipulation that they can exert over their victims. And that can leave a real distinct impact quite aside from the financial loss as well. And so, I think it's really important that it doesn't get lost and that we do continue to enforce and investigate. And with that sort of partnership working is the very best way of doing that.
Emily?
Yeah, I think to pick up that partnership thing, I think for me has to be key, because I think police forces need to recognise that our knowledge base of the legislation, and particularly kind of what we would call the trading standards legislation, that the consumer kind of regulations and things, our knowledge base of that is probably low across the board, really. So I think it's about acknowledging that and then reaching out to those trading standards locally to kind of build that relationship with them and understand more about it and what's the best way to target it, and to not get drawn into forgetting about the kind of the traditional fraud types like this, whilst ever the political focus becomes more and more sort of cyber enabled, really. Because the victims of these types of crime are generally older. They perhaps have a lot of money in bank accounts, as we see a lot with elderly people, like they've amassed, chunks of money, or perhaps it becomes, like you say, the house gets bequeathed and things like that. You're talking about significant amounts of money in a way that you perhaps don't see in other sort of mass marketing types fraud. So I think the risk and the harm is there. It's just a bit of a danger of being lost in the cyber focus, maybe.
I think just to jump in there as well, it's a really important point, what you're saying about how the trading standards offences are viewed and things, because actually all of those offences are recordable offences under Home Office counting rules. So if you've got a call for service as police to go to respond to those, then NCRS, most of the time, they should be being recorded as crimes. And again, it comes back to that sort of lack of definition and lack of understanding. Is currently, I don't see that happening.
No, and we could do a whole podcast episode on why the police struggle to record fraud accurately anyway, and it all comes back to the same lack of sort of understanding and kind of reliable application of the crime recording standards. So yeah, and this is the problem, isn't it? We will talk about it being trading standards legislation. It is criminal legislation, absolutely, and I have no doubt that it's not recorded properly, but it's not recorded because people don't know it's out there, and so that's kind of the starting point for it, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is all we have time for in this episode. I would like to thank Tim and Emily for joining me today and to discuss fraud and doorstep crime. And thank you very much, both of you. My name is Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.